What if two of history's most influential thinkers on human nature could sit down together and hash out the ultimate question that has plagued humanity for millennia? What if the father of psychoanalysis, who believed we're all driven by dark, unconscious urges, could debate the ancient Chinese philosopher who saw goodness as our natural state? Tonight, in a dimly lit corner of a Vienna coffee house, this impossible conversation is about to unfold. The year is 1938, though time seems irrelevant in this space between worlds. Cigarette smoke curls lazily toward the ceiling as Sigmund Freud adjusts his wire-rimmed glasses, studying the elderly Chinese man across from him with the same intensity he once reserved for his most troubled patients. Confucius, serene despite being thousands of years and miles from his homeland, sips his tea with deliberate calm. The coffeehouse buzzes with the quiet conversations of late-night intellectuals, but these two men exist in their own bubble of contemplation. Between them lies a question that has shaped civilizations, justified wars, and inspired countless acts of both cruelty and compassion. Are humans naturally violent or fundamentally good? Freud lights another cigar, the flame briefly illuminating the deep lines etched by decades of wrestling with the human psyche. His eyes, sharp and penetrating, never leave his companion's face. "Jono Kongqiu," he begins, using Confucius's given name with familiar respect. "I've spent my entire career peeling back the civilized veneer of my patients, and underneath, I always find the same thing: violence, aggression, the death drive that compels us toward destruction, both of others and ourselves." Confucius sets down his cup with a gentle clink against the saucer, his weathered hands folded peacefully in his lap. At 73, his face carries the wisdom of someone who has witnessed both the heights of human achievement and the depths of human suffering. "And yet, Dr. Freud, in my 73 years of observing humanity, I have seen something quite different. I have seen children naturally show compassion before they are taught cruelty. I have seen strangers risk their lives for people they have never met. Tell me, how does your theory account for such acts?" The Austrian physician chuckles, but there's no humor in it. "Ah, but you're mistaking the thin coating of civilization for human nature itself. Those acts of kindness you describe? They're learned behaviors, social contracts we've developed to keep our savage impulses in check. Strip away society, remove the fear of punishment, and watch how quickly your naturally good humans turn into beasts." Around them, the coffeehouse continues its evening rhythm. A young couple argues quietly in German, their voices a soft counterpoint to the debate unfolding in the corner. The waiter, recognizing the intensity of the conversation, has long since stopped approaching their table. Confucius leans forward slightly, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher who has explained this concept countless times to skeptical students. "But consider this, my friend. A child who has never been exposed to violence, who grows up in a loving environment, does not naturally become cruel. They must be taught cruelty, trained in it, hardened to it. Is this not evidence that goodness is our natural state and violence the aberration?" Freud's laugh is sharper this time, and he gestures with his cigar, sending ash scattering across the small table. "You speak of ideal children in ideal environments, but show me such a place in the real world. Even in the most loving families, children display jealousy, rage, possessiveness. They bite, they hit, they take what they want without consideration for others. We don't teach them these behaviors. We spend years trying to teach them not to behave this way." The coffeehouse clock chimes 10 times, its brass tones echoing through the smoky air. Both men pause, as if acknowledging that they are settling in for a long night of intellectual combat. This is not a casual disagreement between academics. This is a fundamental clash of worldviews that touches on everything from how we raise our children to how we structure our societies. "You see aggression where I see unmet needs," Confucius responds, his voice maintaining its calm cadence despite the passion behind his words. "A child who bites does so not from inherent cruelty, but because they lack the language to express their frustration. A child who hits has not learned better ways to communicate their desires. With proper guidance, with benevolence, these same children become caring, thoughtful adults." Freud studies his opponent across the table, recognizing in him a worthy intellectual adversary. Here is no naive optimist, but a man who has thought deeply about human nature and emerged with conclusions diametrically opposed to his own. "And yet," Freud counters, "you ignore the evidence of every war, every murder, every act of senseless violence that has ever been committed. Are you telling me that Alexander the Great simply lacked proper guidance? That Napoleon was the product of insufficient education in benevolence?" The question hangs in the air like the cigar smoke, dense and complex. In this moment, The two great minds are not just debating abstract philosophy, they are grappling with the fundamental question of what it means to be human. Freud leans back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, as he prepares to lay out his case with the methodical precision of a surgeon. The coffee house has grown quieter now, the earlier crowd thinning to leave only the most dedicated night owls, and the two philosophers can speak more freely. "Let me tell you about a patient I once treated," Freud begins, his voice dropping to a more intimate register. A respectable banker, pillar of his community, devoted husband and father. Yet in my office, he confessed to fantasies so violent, so deeply disturbing, that even I, who thought I had seen the depths of human darkness, was shaken. This was not a man corrupted by society, Kong Chu. This was a man whose civilized exterior barely contained the savage impulses that drove him. Confucius listens without interruption, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. This is what draws Freud to continue. The Chinese philosopher's willingness to hear uncomfortable truths without immediately rejecting them. You see, my dear colleague, we are not noble beings who occasionally stumble into cruelty. We are barely domesticated animals who have learned to wear masks of civility. Every day, in every interaction, we are one moment of lost control away from revealing our true nature. Freud pauses to take a long draw from his cigar, the ember glowing bright in the dim light. Consider the Great War, which ended just 20 years ago. Millions of young men raised by loving mothers and moral fathers eagerly marched off to slaughter each other, with an enthusiasm that horrified even seasoned generals. How do you explain such bloodlust in your naturally good humans? The weight of this question settles between them like a stone thrown into still water. Confucius does not rush to answer, instead allowing the full implications to resonate. When he finally speaks, his voice carries a sadness that suggests he has wrestled with this very question many times. "The war you speak of was indeed a tragedy beyond measure," Confucius acknowledges. "But tell me, Doctor, Freud, did these young men march to war because they delighted in killing, or because they were told it was their duty to protect their families and homeland? Were they responding to some inner savage impulse, or to the manipulation of their natural protective instincts by those in power?" Freud shakes his head vigorously, ash from his cigar falling onto his vest. "You're still making excuses for behavior that reveals our fundamental nature. Yes, they were told it was their duty, but watch how quickly that duty became bloodlust. Read the letters they sent home, describing the joy they felt in battle, the satisfaction of killing the enemy. You cannot teach such feelings. They emerge from something much deeper and darker within us." The coffeehouse waiter, a thin man with kind eyes, approaches their table hesitantly. Seeing the intensity of their conversation, he simply refills their cups and retreats without a word, understanding instinctively that these men are engaged in something far more important than casual conversation. "But you're focusing only on the darkness," Confucius replies, wrapping his hands around his warm cup. "For every letter describing bloodlust, how many described homesickness, regret, the desire to return to peaceful lives? For every soldier who found joy in killing, how many suffered nightmares and guilt for the rest of their lives? Your selective attention to the dark side blinds you to the evidence of our inherent goodness." Freud's eyes flash with the passion of a man defending his life's work. "Those nightmares and guilt feelings you mention, they're not evidence of goodness, they're evidence of the conflict between our civilized superego and our primitive ID. The guilt exists because we know we're not supposed to enjoy violence, but the enjoyment itself reveals our true nature. We feel guilty precisely because we recognize the savage pleasure we take in dominating and destroying others." The two men sit in momentary silence, each processing the other's arguments. Outside, Vienna goes about its evening business, unaware that in this small coffeehouse, two of history's greatest thinkers are dissecting the very essence of what makes humans human. "Let me offer you another perspective," Freud continues, leaning forward with renewed intensity. "In my clinical practice, I have discovered that our earliest memories, our deepest desires, all center around aggression and sexuality. The infant at its mother's breast is not the picture of innocence you imagine. It is a being driven entirely by the pleasure principle, willing to destroy anything that stands between it and immediate gratification. Civilization consists entirely of teaching us to delay, redirect, or sublimate these primitive impulses." Confucius nods slowly, considering this. "And yet, Dr. Freud, what you describe as primitive impulses, the desire for comfort, for nourishment, for love, these are not inherently violent. An infant cries when hungry not from cruelty but from need. The violence you see is not the impulse itself, but our inability to meet that need appropriately. But you miss the crucial point, Freud insists, his voice rising slightly before he catches himself and glances around the now nearly empty coffee house. The infant doesn't simply want food, it wants exclusive possession of the mother. It rages when the mother's attention goes elsewhere, even to meet the basic needs of others. This is not innocent need. This is the beginning of the murderous jealousy that will define human relationships throughout life. The debate is reaching a crucial juncture, each man presenting not just arguments, but entire worldviews built upon decades of observation and reflection. In this moment, they are not just discussing human nature, they are revealing the fundamental assumptions that have shaped their understanding of existence itself. Confucius sets down his teacup with deliberate care, the gentle sound creating a moment of calm in the increasingly heated debate. When he looks up at Freud, his eyes hold the depth of someone who has spent a lifetime not just observing human nature, but actively working to cultivate its best qualities. "My dear Dr. Freud," he begins, his voice carrying the patient wisdom of a teacher who has seen countless students struggle with difficult concepts. "You speak of the infant's supposed jealousy and rage, but I wonder if you have truly observed infants with fresh eyes, or if you see only what your theory requires you to see." He pauses, allowing his words to settle like tea leaves in hot water. Around them, the coffee house has grown almost empty, the late hour having driven away all but the most dedicated patrons. The intimacy of the space seems to encourage deeper honesty. I have watched children who have never been taught to share spontaneously offer their food to a crying playmate. I have seen toddlers, barely able to walk themselves, rush to comfort another child who has fallen. These are not learned behaviors, my friend. These children have not yet had time to learn such complex social scripts. These actions spring from something much more fundamental, our natural capacity for for benevolence. Freud's eyebrows raise skeptically, but he doesn't interrupt. Despite his disagreement, he respects the thoughtfulness of his opponent's approach. "You ask about the Great War," Confucius continues, his voice taking on a more somber tone. "Yes, millions died in terrible violence, but consider also the millions who risked their lives to save wounded enemies, who shared their rations with prisoners, who wrote letters home expressing not bloodlust but longing for peace. Consider the countless acts of mercy that occurred even in the midst of that great tragedy." The Chinese philosopher leans forward, his weathered hands gesturing gently as he speaks. "And what of the aftermath? When the fighting ended, did these supposedly savage humans continue their violence? No, they returned home, rebuilt their communities, raised families, created art and music and literature. They transformed the instruments of war into tools of peace. Is this not evidence that violence was the aberration, and peaceful creativity their natural state?" Freud shifts uncomfortably in his chair, not because the argument lacks merit, but because it challenges assumptions he has held for decades. "But you're romanticizing the return from war," he protests. "Many of those veterans struggled with what we now call shell shock, unable to readjust to civilian life. The violence they experienced changed them permanently." "Exactly my point," Confucius responds with a slight smile. "If violence were truly our natural state, why would it traumatize us so deeply? Why would the human psyche rebel against it with such force? The very existence of what you call shell shock proves that violence goes against our fundamental nature." The waiter approaches one final time, clearly hoping to close the establishment, but seeing the intensity of the conversation, he simply places a small plate of pastries on their table and retreats to give them more time. "Let me share something from my own experience," Confucius says, breaking off a small piece of pastry and offering it to Freud before taking any himself, a gesture that doesn't go unnoticed. "When I was a young man, I witnessed a public execution. The crowd had gathered expecting entertainment, as crowds often do at such spectacles. But when the moment came, when the sword fell, something remarkable happened. The crowd fell silent. Many turned away. Some wept. Others became ill." He pauses, allowing the image to form in Freud's mind. Now, if humans were naturally violent, if we truly delighted in death and suffering, would this not have been a moment of celebration? Instead, even those who came seeking violence found themselves confronted with their own capacity for compassion. Their natural goodness asserted itself despite their conscious intentions. Freud considers this carefully, his analytical mind working through the implications. "But surely you acknowledge that some people do take pleasure in others' suffering. I have encountered patients who derive genuine satisfaction from causing pain. Indeed, such people exist. Confucius agrees readily. But tell me, in your clinical experience, were these individuals raised in environments of love and security, or had they themselves been subjected to violence, neglect, or trauma? My observation has been that cruelty is almost always a response to having one's natural goodness wounded or suppressed. This gives Freud pause. In his years of practice, he has indeed found that his most troubled patients often came from backgrounds of abuse or severe emotional deprivation. But his theoretical framework has always attributed this to the failure of civilization to properly channel their inherent aggression, rather than to damage done to their inherent goodness. You're suggesting that humans are naturally good, but become corrupted by their environment, Freud muses aloud. But how do you account for the first act of cruelty? In your model, who was the first person to wound another's natural goodness? If we're all born good, where does evil originate? Confucius smiles at this question, recognizing it as one that has challenged philosophers for millennia. Perhaps evil is not something that originates from within us, but something that emerges from our circumstances. When resources are scarce, when people are afraid, when they feel threatened or desperate, they may act in ways that contradict their natural goodness, but these actions stem from external pressures, not internal darkness. So you believe that in ideal circumstances, humans would never commit violence? Freud asks, genuine curiosity replacing some of his earlier skepticism. I believe that in circumstances where people feel safe, valued, and cared for, violence becomes unnecessary and therefore rare, Confucius replies. This is why proper governance and education are so crucial, not to suppress our savage nature, as you might argue, but to create conditions where our good nature can flourish. The debate has reached a fascinating crossroads, where two fundamentally different views of human nature are beginning to reveal their practical implications for how society should be organized and how individuals should be treated. Freud takes a long, contemplative draw from his cigar, the smoke forming complex patterns in the still air of the nearly empty coffee house. The clock on the wall now reads past 11, but neither man shows any sign of fatigue. If anything, the late hour seems to have sharpened their focus, stripping away pretense to reveal the core of their philosophical differences. Your vision of ideal circumstances creating naturally good behavior, Freud says slowly, choosing his words with the precision of a master craftsman, reminds me of something I wrote about the discontents of civilization. You see, Concu, I believe you have the relationship between humans and society exactly backwards. He leans forward, his eyes intense behind his wire-rimmed glasses. You suggest that society should create conditions for our good nature to flourish. But consider this, if humans were naturally good, why would we need society at all? Why would we require laws, police, courts, prisons? Why would every civilization in history have developed elaborate systems of punishment and control? The weight of this question settles between them. Confucius listens intently, recognizing that Freud is presenting one of the strongest challenges to his worldview. I propose to you, Freud continues, his voice gaining momentum, that civilization exists precisely because humans are not naturally good. Every law represents a recognition of our tendency toward antisocial behavior. Every moral teaching is an attempt to redirect our natural aggression into socially acceptable channels. We don't create civilization to nurture our goodness. We create it to survive our own savage impulses. The Austrian physician pauses to observe his opponent's reaction. Confucius remains calm, but Freud can see the gears turning behind those ancient, thoughtful eyes. Think about it, Freud presses on. The very first human settlements required walls, not to keep wild animals out, but to keep other humans out. The earliest laws weren't guidelines for moral behavior. They were desperate attempts to prevent murder, theft, and rape. If humans were naturally inclined toward goodness, why would such measures have been necessary? Confucius nods slowly, acknowledging the strength of the argument while formulating his response. You raise important points, Dr. Freud, but I believe you misunderstand the purpose of social structures. Laws and governance are not evidence of our evil nature. They are tools to help us become our best selves. He gestures toward the window where the lights of Vienna twinkle in the darkness. Consider that same city you mention, with its walls and laws. Yes, it needed protection, but what did it protect? Not just life and property, but art, learning, music, philosophy. The walls kept out not human evil, but human ignorance and desperation. Inside those walls, people created beauty, pursued knowledge, cared for the sick and elderly. Freud's expression remains skeptical, but he's clearly engaged by this alternative interpretation. Furthermore, Confucius continues, you assume that because laws exist, they are necessary because of evil impulses. But consider that many laws exist not to prevent harm but to coordinate beneficial behavior. Traffic laws don't exist because drivers are evil and want to crash into each other. They exist because cooperation requires structure. Marriage laws don't exist because humans naturally hate each other. They exist to provide frameworks for love and commitment. The Chinese philosopher pauses to sip his tea, which has grown cold during their intense discussion. You speak of prisons and punishment, but tell me, Dr. Freud, what happens to a person's behavior when they are treated with consistent kindness and respect? In my experience, even those who have committed great wrongs often respond to genuine care with transformation. Freud laughs, but there's less derision in it than before. Now you sound like the naive reformers who believe that criminals simply need a kind word and a warm meal. I've treated patients who have committed terrible acts, and I can tell you that their capacity for violence runs much deeper than any surface kindness can reach. But did you treat them with genuine love? Confucius asks quietly. Or did you treat them as case studies, as problems to be solved? There is a profound difference between professional care and authentic human connection. This question hits closer to home than Freud expected. In his clinical practice, he has always maintained professional distance, analyzing his patients rather than truly embracing them as fellow human beings. The suggestion that this approach might have limited his understanding of human nature is uncomfortable. You're asking me to believe, Freud says carefully, that if we simply loved people enough, they would naturally behave well. But what about those who are incapable of receiving love? What about those who interpret kindness as weakness to be exploited? Confucius considers this thoughtfully. I don't claim that love is a magic cure for all human problems. Some people have been so wounded, so twisted by their experiences, that they may never fully recover their natural goodness. But this doesn't disprove the existence of that goodness. It simply shows how much damage can be done when it is neglected or attacked. The debate has evolved from theoretical arguments to something more personal, touching on each man's deepest beliefs about the possibility of human redemption and the nature of healing. And what of those who wound others? Freud presses. If someone has harmed a child, destroyed a family, committed acts of unconscionable cruelty, should society respond with love and understanding? Or does such evil require punishment, containment, perhaps even elimination? Justice and compassion are not opposites, Confucius replies firmly. A person who has harmed others must face consequences for their actions, not because they are inherently evil, but because they need to understand the impact of their choices and learn better ways of being. But if our response is purely punitive, if we meet cruelty with cruelty, we risk becoming the very thing we claim to oppose. The conversation has reached a crucial point where philosophical differences translate into practical questions about how society should respond to its most troubled members. The coffee house has now emptied completely, except for the two philosophers and the patient waiter, who has given up any pretense of wanting to close and has settled into reading a newspaper at the bar. The silence outside makes their conversation feel even more intimate, as if the entire world has paused to listen to their debate. Confucius sets both hands flat on the small table, a gesture that signals he is about to address the heart of their disagreement. Dr. Freud, I think we have been dancing around the central question without addressing it directly. The question is not whether humans are capable of both good and evil. Clearly we are. The question is which tendency is natural to us and which requires cultivation. He pauses, allowing this reframing to settle. You believe that goodness must be imposed upon our naturally violent nature through the external force of civilization. I believe that evil arises when our naturally good nature is corrupted or suppressed, and that the role of society should be to cultivate and strengthen what is already within us. Freud nods, appreciating the clarity of this distinction. So you're saying that virtue is like a plant that grows naturally if given proper conditions, while I'm saying that virtue is like a building that must be constructed with great effort against the natural tendency toward decay and collapse. Precisely, Confucius confirms. And this difference in understanding leads to very different approaches to raising children, governing societies, and treating those who have lost their way. The Chinese philosopher's voice takes on the warm tone of someone sharing deeply personal wisdom. Let me tell you about a student I once had, a young man who came to me filled with rage and bitterness. His father had been killed by bandits, his family's land seized by corrupt officials. He wanted to learn philosophy, only so he could better plan his revenge. Freud listens with genuine interest, recognizing the therapeutic parallels to his own work. According to your theory, Confucius continues, this young man was simply expressing his natural aggressive impulses, and my job should have been to help him channel that aggression into socially acceptable forms. But I took a different approach. I helped him see that his rage, while understandable, was poison that was destroying him from within. I taught him that his father's goodness lived on in him, and that the best way to honor his father's memory was not through revenge, but through becoming the kind of person his father had raised him to be. And did this philosophical counseling cure his violent impulses? Freud asks, his tone suggesting he expects to hear about the student's eventual breakdown or criminal behavior. I became one of the most compassionate leaders I ever knew, Confucius replies simply. He spent his life working to reform the very corrupt systems that had destroyed his family, but he did so through building better institutions, not through violence. His goodness, once reconnected to its source, became a force for healing rather than destruction. Freud considers this story carefully. In his experience, trauma typically led to repetition, victims becoming perpetrators, the wounded wounding others. The idea that someone could transform such deep pain into constructive action challenges his understanding of how the human psyche works. But surely you acknowledge, Freud says, that this student was exceptional. For every one person who transforms their trauma into wisdom, how many become bitter, destructive, or simply broken? Your approach might work for the naturally resilient, but what about those who lack such inner strength? Confucius smiles at this question, the expression of someone who has heard this objection many times. But here you reveal your assumption that strength comes from within the individual alone. I believe that strength comes from connection, to family, to community, to principles larger than ourselves. A person is not born resilient or fragile. They become so based on the relationships and support systems available to them. He gestures toward the warm light of the coffee house around them. Even this conversation, Dr. Freud, demonstrates my point. We are two old men with very different views, yet we sit here treating each other with respect and courtesy. Why? Not because we have suppressed our savage impulses, but because we recognize our shared humanity, our common search for truth. Freud chuckles, acknowledging the irony. Though I notice we have been debating quite vigorously. Perhaps our civilized behavior is simply a thin veneer over our competitive instincts. Or perhaps, Confucius counters gently, our vigorous debate is itself an expression of our natural goodness, our desire to understand truth, to challenge each other's thinking in service of greater wisdom. Competition and cooperation are not opposites when both parties share a common goal. This reframing gives Freud pause. He has always thought of intellectual debate as a form of sublimated aggression, but Confucius suggests it might be something else entirely, a collaborative search for understanding disguised as competition. You speak beautifully of human potential, Freud says slowly, but you still haven't addressed the problem of evil that exists in the world. If humans are naturally good, if proper cultivation can help anyone become virtuous, then how do you explain those who seem irredeemably corrupt? What about those who take pleasure in others' suffering, who seem incapable of empathy or remorse? Confucius's expression grows more serious, acknowledging that this question strikes at the heart of his philosophy. I do not claim that every person can be reached, Dr. Freud. Some have been damaged so severely, or have traveled so far down the path of cruelty that they may be beyond redemption in this lifetime. But I refuse to accept that such people prove the essential evil of human nature, any more than a diseased tree proves that all trees are naturally sick. The metaphor hangs in the air between them, elegant in its simplicity, yet profound in its implications for how society should understand and respond to its most troubled members. As the night deepens around them, something shifts in the atmosphere of their debate. Perhaps it's the lateness of the hour, or the way their theoretical arguments have gradually revealed the personal experiences that shaped them, but both men seem to recognize that they are no longer simply discussing abstract philosophy. They are examining the fundamental assumptions that have guided their life's work. Freud removes his glasses and cleans them slowly, a gesture that reveals both his fatigue and his reluctance to meet Confucius's steady gaze. When he speaks again, his voice carries a weight of personal revelation that has been absent from their earlier exchanges. You know, Kongkyo, I have spent 40 years listening to the secrets people keep locked away in their hearts, and I can tell you that what I have heard there would shake your faith in human goodness, not just the dramatic cases of violence and abuse, but the everyday cruelties we inflict on those closest to us. The husband who systematically destroys his wife's confidence, The mother who uses her child's love as a weapon, the friend who betrays trust for the smallest advantage. He replaces his glasses and looks directly at Confucius, his eyes reflecting decades of accumulated disillusionment. These are not people driven to evil by desperate circumstances. These are ordinary people, living comfortable lives, who nonetheless find satisfaction in the suffering of others. How does your theory of natural goodness account for such calculated cruelty? Confucius receives this challenge without flinching, understanding that Freud is sharing not just professional observations but personal pain. I hear in your words, my friend, not just analytical conclusions but genuine sorrow. You have seen much darkness, and it has wounded you deeply. The acknowledgement of his emotional state catches Freud off guard. In his professional life, he is the one who interprets others' feelings, not the one whose feelings are exposed and understood. The role reversal is both uncomfortable and oddly liberating. But tell me, Confucius continues gently, in all your years of practice, have you never seen transformation? Have you never witnessed someone move from cruelty to kindness, from selfishness to generosity? If humans were truly evil by nature, would such changes even be possible? Freud considers this carefully. Indeed, he has seen patients make remarkable changes, though he has always attributed these to the successful rechanneling of aggressive impulses rather than to the emergence of inherent goodness. I have seen people learn to control their destructive behaviors, he admits, but underneath the same dark impulses remain. Therapy doesn't eliminate our capacity for evil, it simply teaches us to manage it more effectively. Or perhaps, Confucius suggests, what you call learning to control dark impulses is actually the process of reconnecting with goodness that was always present but buried under layers of pain, fear, and learned behavior. The Chinese philosopher leans back in his chair, his expression growing more reflective. I too have personal stakes in this debate, Dr. Freud. I have lived through times of great violence and upheaval. I have seen the collapse of the social order I devoted my life to building. I have watched good people do terrible things when they were afraid or desperate. His voice takes on a note of profound sadness. There were moments when I questioned everything I believed about human nature, when I saw respected leaders abandon their principles for power, when I witnessed communities tear themselves apart over petty jealousies, when I observed the strong routinely crushing the weak without remorse. Freud nods, recognizing a kindred spirit in disillusionment despite their philosophical differences. But in those same dark times, Confucius continues, I also witnessed extraordinary acts of courage and compassion. I saw people risk everything to protect strangers, sacrifice their own comfort to care for the elderly and sick, choose poverty over participating in corruption. These acts of goodness often went unnoticed and unrewarded, which convinced me that they sprang from something deeper than social conditioning. The two men sit in contemplative silence for a moment, each processing the other's personal revelations. The waiter, sensing the gravity of their conversation, approaches quietly to refill their cups one more time. Perhaps, Freud says slowly, we are both right and both wrong. Perhaps humans are neither naturally good nor naturally evil, but naturally complex. Perhaps we are creatures capable of both extraordinary compassion and appalling cruelty, and our task is not to deny one side of our nature, but to understand how both can coexist. Confucius considers this carefully. There is wisdom in what you say, Dr. Freud, but even if we accept this complexity, we still must choose which aspect of human nature to cultivate and encourage. If we assume the worst about people, we create systems based on fear and control. If we assume the best, we create systems based on trust and empowerment. And if we assume the worst and are wrong, Freud muses, we may prevent much good from flourishing, but if we assume the best and are wrong, we may enable great evil. The stakes of their philosophical debate have become clear. It's not simply about understanding human nature, but about deciding how to structure society, raise children, and treat those who transgress against community norms. So we return to our central question, Confucius observes, not just what humans are, but what they could become under the right conditions, and perhaps more importantly, what we risk by betting on one answer rather than the other. The clock strikes midnight, and both men notice the symbolic weight of the moment. They have been debating for hours, each presenting passionate arguments for their worldview, yet neither has converted the other to his way of thinking. Instead, something more subtle and perhaps more valuable has occurred. They have deepened their understanding of both their differences and their shared concerns. Freud stubs out his cigar in the glass ashtray, the gesture marking a transition from heated debate to quieter reflection. You know, Conq, I find myself thinking about something you said earlier, about the soldiers returning from war. The fact that many suffered what we now call trauma from their violent experiences. Perhaps you're right that this suggests violence goes against something fundamental in human nature. Confucius nods appreciatively at this concession, understanding how difficult it must be for Freud to acknowledge evidence that challenges his life's work. And I have been reflecting on your observations about the universal need for laws and social structures. Perhaps my view of natural goodness has been too naive about the challenges of organizing complex societies. The waiter, who has been listening discreetly to their conversation while pretending to clean glasses, approaches their table with obvious reluctance to interrupt, but clear need to close the establishment. Gentlemen, I hate to disturb such a fascinating discussion, but I'm afraid I must ask. Of course, Freud says graciously, reaching for his wallet. We've imposed on your hospitality far too long. Not at all, the waiter replies earnestly. I've never heard anything quite like this conversation. If I may ask, have you reached any conclusions? Confucius and Freud exchange glances, both smiling at the question that cuts to the heart of their evening's work. We've reached the conclusion that the question itself is more complex than either of us initially believed, Confucius replies, and perhaps that's the most important discovery of all. As they prepare to leave, gathering their coats and settling their bill, Freud turns to his philosophical opponent with genuine curiosity. If we were to continue this conversation, where would you suggest we go from here? Confucius considers this carefully. Perhaps we might explore not just whether humans are good or evil by nature, but what conditions bring out the best and worst in us. If you're right that we have dangerous impulses that need to be contained, and I'm right that we have good impulses that need to be nurtured, then our real task might be learning how to do both effectively. A practical philosophy rather than a purely theoretical one, Freud muses. I admit there's appeal in that approach. Instead of arguing about what humans are, we could focus on what helps them become their best selves. They walk together toward the door of the coffee house, their earlier antagonism replaced by mutual respect and intellectual curiosity. The streets of Vienna are quiet now, lit by gas lamps that create pools of warm light in the darkness. You know, Freud says as they step into the cool night air, regardless of our differences about human nature, I think we both agree on something important. People are worth the effort. Whether we're trying to control their dark impulses or nurture their good ones, we both believe that individual humans matter enough to deserve our best thinking and care. Confucius smiles at this observation, recognizing it as perhaps the most important common ground they've discovered. Yes, and perhaps that shared commitment is more significant than our theoretical disagreements. Whether we see humans as naturally good or naturally flawed, we both want to help them live better lives. They pause at the corner where their paths will diverge, neither quite ready to end a conversation that has challenged and enriched both of their perspectives. I wonder, Confucius says thoughtfully, if our different views might actually complement each other rather than contradict each other. Your insights into the darker aspects of human psychology could help my approach to education and social reform become more effective, and perhaps my focus on human potential could help your therapeutic methods become more hopeful. Freud nods slowly, intrigued by this possibility. A synthesis rather than a victory for either side. The idea has merit. We could acknowledge both the dangers you warn against and the possibilities I believe in. As they shake hands in parting, both men understand that their debate has not ended but evolved. They have not resolved the ancient question of human nature, but they have modeled something important, the possibility of passionate disagreement combined with genuine respect, of holding firm convictions while remaining open to new perspectives. The question of whether humans are naturally violent or fundamentally good remains as complex and unresolved as when they began. But perhaps their conversation suggests a different answer altogether, that humans are naturally curious, naturally social, naturally capable of growth and change, that we are beings who can spend an entire evening debating our own nature and somehow become better people in the process. As they walk away in opposite directions, each carrying the other's arguments with him into the night, they embody the very possibility they have been debating, the human capacity to engage with difficult questions, to challenge and be challenged, to seek truth together even when we cannot agree on what truth looks like. In the end, perhaps that capacity itself, the ability to wrestle with fundamental questions about who we are and who we might become, is the most essentially human characteristic of all.